All right. Well, today on our Mastermind Live Q&A, we've got Will here from Exeter University. He's Associate Dean of Research. I'll get into your introduction in a bit, Will. I just wanted to go through a few things first. I do tend to talk quite fast, so if anyone has any issues with that, that's on the event. Just let me know. Throw that in the chat box. Tell me to slow down a little bit. That's fine. So basically, this will last about 30 minutes, I think, or give or take. For those that are listening on our podcast or on the recording, welcome to you. Nice to see you. Hopefully, this is useful. So basically, what we're going to do, go through a quick introduction of what we do here at Belmont Levan, myself. I'll let Will go through what he does. We've got a quick presentation to go through some things on obviously managing and kind of safeguarding your reputation right now and through the crisis essentially. And then we've got some time for some questions. We do have some questions that people put in already beforehand from some people that we spoke to in advance of this this live event. So let's get things going. If anything has anything to say, throw it in the chat box. Just throw an R or an L to say, or even a Q just to say question, I for insight, anything like that. If you have anything to say throughout the presentation, and we'll go into questions kind of after each main topic. So let me just get this going. Here we go. So what this group is and why. Introduction to Will here, different types of reputation, managing reputation kind of through crises, authenticity, and just our Q&A. So me and Belmont Levan. Well, Belmont Levan, we're obviously a recruitment firm. This call obviously isn't about recruitment. Mainly it's to help leaders and senior people within our client base, essentially startups and scale-ups within tech across Europe. Worldwide even. So that's what this is all about, and that's what we focus on. So we do a number of executive roles, product marketing, CPO, all that type of stuff. Me personally, I've spent 6 years in recruitment, and I come from a marketing and communications background, and I've got a lifelong passion for products, so that's where we are today. So I'll let Will introduce himself, and he can kind of go through where he came from, what he does, and what his focus is on.
Thanks very much, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name's Will Harvey. I'm a professor at the University of Exeter Business School in the Southwest in the UK. I'm Associate Dean of Research, which means I'm essentially the strategic lead for research in the business school. Most of my research now is focused in the area of reputation, and that's an area that I'm going to focus on today. I've also done work on social networks, mobility of highly skilled workers, and a lot of my work has involved researching elites in different contexts. So that's business elites, political elites, a range of people in senior roles. And a lot of my work engages both with academics and top journals across the world, as well as with practitioners. So really looking forward to sharing some of my insights and hearing your questions.
Awesome, Will, thanks. So let's get into this. I mean, the first thing that a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but I thought we should probably go through is just different types of reputation. I know this is something that you did cover in one of those articles you've written recently. So it's probably a good place to start, because obviously, reputation means different things to different people. And I mean, obviously it's kind of difficult to quantify in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me try and keep my definition of reputation fairly simple. I guess the first thing to note about reputation is it's a perception and not a fact. It's not what one individual necessarily thinks. It tends to be an aggregation of multiple stakeholder groups and how they think and feel about an organization, or it could be a product within an organization, for instance. And so on this slide, you can see kind of 4 areas that I think are really important in terms of different types of reputation to consider. One is the for something. So often, of course, customers are interested in the quality of a given product or the particular service that's being delivered. So that's one type of reputation. The other is considering your reputation with someone. So of course, for a lot of organizations, that's going to be focused on your customers. But of course, every organization has a different set of stakeholders. So all organizations have employees, so that would be another stakeholder group. Some will have investors and partners, for instance. So it's worth considering not only who are your stakeholders, but who are the most salient stakeholders that you need to engage with. The third aspect is around reputation in some place. And this is kind of flagging the fact that whether you operate locally or globally, how you're perceived in different geographic entities is going to vary. So let me give you an example. I did a big project on a global management consulting company, and I did interviews, surveys all over the world. And what's so interesting is you've got one firm and one single brand, but when you ask people in different geographic jurisdictions about the reputation of that organization, it was very, very different. And so that's just something to bear in mind, that you may try and achieve coherence across jurisdictions, but actually how you're perceived at a local level or even at a national level may vary. And then the final point to make about reputation is it's not something that's impulsive. It is something that develops over time. And that's worth bearing in mind, because when different stakeholders perceive you, they will often be looking at your perception at that moment in time versus what you've done in the past. And so when you're thinking about right now, for instance, pivoting into a new area of operation, just be mindful that reputation can be sticky, meaning that it can be quite hard to convince other stakeholders, for instance, your customers or your clients, that actually we're not this type of organization anymore, we're that kind of organization. So you're going to need to help them on that journey.
So in terms of actually helping them on that journey, what would that might entail? Maybe like a, an actionable type of thing that people can kind of do. Is that just in relation to their messaging, or what would that kind of be?
Well, let me give you an example in your world, Michael, right? So I did a project on executive search firms in Australia during the last global financial crisis.
Okay.
And of course, during that particular crisis, there were a lot of challenges around search, because of course, there's less roles going around, there's less demand to place senior people in top organizations. And so what a lot of organizations, executive search firms, started to do was think, well, where are the kind of aligning areas of activity that we could help our clients with? And so what you started to see is a focus on leadership development, succession planning, diagnostics around leadership, some consulting around leadership. Now, so one aspect is just identifying those kind of areas of opportunity. And then the second aspect is then working with your key stakeholders to talk them through how you've got legitimacy in these new areas that you're claiming for. So you've got to do more than just tell. You've actually got to persuade those key people that you've got the relevant expertise that they're looking for.
All right, that makes sense. So if anyone has any questions on that, obviously just throw them there in the Q&A box. Of course, we'll probably just go to it at the end because it's kind of a little bit easier to segue through to the next part here. So just based off what we're talking about. So I mean, you did have an article, obviously, and it went through, some of these main questions, kind of managing the rep of your business. I do know that that was kind of a little bit more focused on internal, maybe, reputation as well, more than external. But obviously, a lot of these things still do apply, especially, you're seeing a lot of different companies putting out essentially messaging about what they're actually doing with their own internal employees, even. So I think that no matter what, this stuff is being put out across the board by organizations, whether it be internally or externally. So, I mean, maybe you could go through those. I mean, we've put on here compassion and cause as kind of the two big ones because, well, it's like, because last week we had a live event. There was a bunch of points about how, or Michael Saka from Dribble was actually making some points on how he's thinking that a lot of companies are going to be essentially doing like posting about how they're supporting their communities and doing charity work and that type of thing, and that to almost legitimize what they're doing in terms of marketing to a certain extent that we're trying to support these people, not only our customers, but our employees and the community and that type of thing. So obviously that's something that he thought that was probably a lot of firms are going to be doing. But I mean, I'll leave you to go through maybe these questions and kind of how those things are important.
Sure, thanks, Michael. And this is an article that I wrote in the European Business Review, just thinking about the current sort of times, the types of things that you can do. Let me just very briefly go through each one without going into sort of unnecessary detail here. So if we start at the top with the light orange circle, how are you showing compassion? I think that the point here is just particularly being mindful of the needs of your employees. For instance, some of them are going to be focus on childcare, parental care. They may well have health and well-being challenges themselves. So showing empathy, I think, for your employees and other groups is really important. And that sort of links to the next one in the green, what are you doing to support? So it's one thing showing empathy, but then there's a second step, which is, well, what are you actually tangibly doing to sort of help these people? So let me give you a brief example. My dean in the business school at the University of Exeter, for instance, he initiated a policy across the business school that it's expected that no one will send any emails before 8:30 in the morning or after 5:30 p.m. at night. It's a very simple policy, but I think it sends a very important message that everyone's sort of under a lot of strain, and that's fine for people to draft emails and do work outside of that, but it's not expected that they'll be sent or necessarily received. So I think that's the kind of thing that's showing sort of support during a kind of a difficult period. And of course, every organization and leader will have their own approach to that. The third aspect, which Michael flagged, which is in the light blue, is how are you helping the cause? I think, because this is such a majorly important and challenging macro environment right now, showing that you have compassion and emotion to the wider challenges, I think it is really valuable. Now, some organizations can do that in very powerful ways. If you're a gin making company suddenly pivoting to create alcohol gel sanitizer, that's a great story. Or you're an F1 engineering company, and then suddenly you're moving into creating ventilators. That's brilliant, but not all organizations are going to be able to do that. But I think in different ways, touching upon Michael's point about engaging with the local community, there are ways in which every organization and every person can do something at a small level to help the cause. Where are the backups? In the same way that it's expected in any organization that you would have a succession planning and replacement planning process, I think it's really important to establish where are your backups. So if the chief executive gets ill, but equally if you've got different levels of people across the organization who are either unavailable or voluntarily or otherwise, then you've got to think carefully about, well, what's the backup in terms of your personnel? At the bottom is about transparency. This is, I think, really important. It's often assumed that 100% transparency is important, but actually, of course, we all know the reality is that 100% transparency could be unethical in some instances. So just thinking about how can you be open and honest with different groups around the circumstances, around what you're doing, without unnecessarily providing information which could cause an anxiety, for instance, or could reveal information which wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. And then the next point in the light purple is what and when are you communicating? I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we can over communicate. There is a lot of information out there. I'm sure most of you are receiving a very large volume of emails, both in a work context, but also from different products and companies that you're engaging with on a regular basis, and that can just be saturating. And so just thinking about the volume, but also the timing of when you send those as well. And that links to the next point in pink around sort of how are you engaging with work-life boundaries. And that sort of comes back to my earlier point about being mindful that everyone is in a difficult situation right now, and thinking carefully about sort of how you personally manage that, as well as helping other people who are working for or with you to manage that, because clearly having some set of boundaries in a very heavily digital focused environment is going to be really, really important. And then the final point really to make here is what are you doing in terms of sustaining professional relationships? Of course, lots of staff at the moment have been furloughed, and or we've got a situation where a lot of your partners, a lot of your customers, a lot of your clients, you've got a more distant relationship with them because of the volume of activity going on. But just because people aren't necessarily buying your products and services, or they're not currently working for you necessarily, that doesn't mean you can't have a strong professional relationship. And I think there's a tendency to go cold turkey and cut people off, but I don't think that's a very good medium and long-term strategy in terms of sustaining and maintaining those relationships, because they're exactly the kinds of people that you're going to need when things start to crank up again. So that would be kind of my summary there, Michael.
Awesome, that makes sense. So, I mean, in general, I mean, is there kind of like a scale of where or what maybe to do first? I think that comes up a lot with people. You know, if they're to you know, create a set of action steps or something like that towards, you know, how do I start doing this if it's something they haven't really done before. Obviously, you know, a lot of, you know, they think about it when it comes to marketing or their product or their branding per se, but how, you know, in terms of, let's say, reputation itself, if they're going to utilize these things to specifically focus on improving their rep, or, you know, safeguarding it to a certain extent, is there kind of a, you know, a step-by-step process, or is there a place that they should start that you would maybe recommend?
Great question. I would say that rather than adopting a template, think about it as having some kind of heuristic. And what I mean by that, I'm not trying to be sort of overly clever, but I don't think one standardized approach is necessarily going to be helpful, because every organization is obviously different. But what I would say is that ensuring that you as an individual, if you're a leader or your senior team, you have clarity internally in terms of your approach. I think that's a really important starting point. And once you've got clarity internally, then the second obvious point is around how are you going to communicate and engage with your different stakeholders, knowing that that form of communication and engagement is going to differ according to the stakeholder. So clearly, you know, how you're going to engage with your staff is going to be quite different from your customers, or how you're going to kind of engage with your collaborators. And then I guess the third aspect is thinking carefully about, this is a short-term, relatively short-term phenomenon. Of course, you know, how that manifests over time is clearly going to be much longer, but thinking about what are you going to do once this kind of first phase is over? How are you going to move? Let's say the phase we're currently in is a red phase. How are you going to sort of change your modus operandi in the amber stage, which is kind of going to be a transition phase, and then thinking further along to kind of a more green phase, which will be longer down the line, and it won't be the same as where we were before, but it will be getting back to relative normality. So I'd say that would be kind of the broad approach that I would take, but how that lands will really depend upon the culture of your organization, the structure of your organization, and the nature of your stakeholder group.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, so really take a view through those different you know, questions that we went through. Obviously, we'll include the link to the article, this, and you know, the presentation as well, so that people can go through kind of what we've been talking about to get a better idea of it. Start by reviewing those, and kind of establish that internally, you know, maybe your answers to those questions and how you're approaching it, and kind of go from that point. But not really, there's no real specific place to start, but more like just start. You
Yeah.
know,
I'd say having a structure, having a plan, communicating that and thinking about the time horizon within which that operates would be kind of a rough heuristic. But of course, you know, I don't think you can be that specific at a general level because of, you know, the
Well,
points
yeah,
that I made.
too many different things, right? Every company
Yeah,
is different.
exactly.
But yeah, that kind of high level overview or general overview I mean, that should pretty much help people. So we've got some main questions here that were brought up before the webinar, so we obviously got these in because it's kind of an amalgamation of 15, 20 different questions that we got. So first one here is, you know, what must companies do to establish and maintain authenticity in regards to their reputation right now, I guess, and it also applies to kind of as we go forwards.
Yeah, I think this is really important to think about. You know, with when we think about authenticity, it's, you know, being true to yourself and ensuring that, you know, how you see yourself as an organization, it is reflected in how you engage and communicate with your different groups. And so that comes back to an earlier point that I made in the previous discussion about the level of information that you're providing. Excuse me. So I think um, I don't think it's always appropriate or necessary to provide 100% transparency for reasons that I've mentioned already. But of course, if clients or employees feel that you're withholding or you're facading important information which is relevant to them, then I think that's a real problem. And normally people pick up on signals quite quickly as well in any case. So I think just gauging the level of communication that you're having with your key groups is a really good starting point. And then thinking alongside that around sort of how frequently does it make sense to engage with people, and sort of how detailed do you need to be, you know, with that information. And sort of, I guess my overarching approach, coming back to the point about having an oversaturation of information, is that I think some degree of frequency is good, but not to have too much information within any one given communication channel. I'm sure lots of you have received these very long emails or documents, and in my view, they just don't get read. So I just don't think that's a helpful or a useful communication tool. I don't think they get read anyway, but during the period we're in right now, where people are being saturated with similar types of messaging, I think it's even less likely people will read, let alone actually absorb that communication.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people are, you know, overloaded with, you know, the first line of every email being, "I know you're struggling in this time," or, you know, there's a lot of compilation videos out there right now, different, you know, ads that have gone out, Toyota being one of the big ones, you know, of essentially the same ad format of, you know, open streets, empty roads, you know, we support the community and then insert product here, you know, whatever it is, and it's not really even related to what they've been saying. So, I mean, that ties into authenticity as well as even that next question, which is kind of, is there a way to showcase, you know, that kind of support without, you know, becoming cheap or insincere, or again, kind of just completely blowing up your reputation, you know, maybe you genuinely are helping or want to help, or, you know, the support the cause, I guess you could say. But I mean, again, something like that obviously is at one extreme where it comes off, you know, obviously you shouldn't do that. But I mean, you know, is there a better way to maybe do it in terms of going out? I mean, you kind of mentioned that maybe being a bit more general and not having it completely overloading the amount of information that you're actually doing. So maybe, you know, going out with, you know, not too frequent messaging, but an overview of what people are doing and how that's going to not only help the company and their employees, but the, you know, the community and the message that people going out to the consumers or the customers. Maybe that's a way. But you know, we've been kind of speculating with a bunch of different people on that. But maybe you have some advice or thoughts.
Yeah, I think a few things to mention here. One, I think this is an opportunity for you in a non-sales pitch way to explain to different groups some of the initiatives that you're taking. Now, those initiatives might be around safeguarding your organization. It might be around explaining some of the really positive things you're doing to support different stakeholder groups, or it may be even about some fantastic initiatives that you're doing to kind of help the cause, as I mentioned before. So I think that would be one way of kind of projecting authenticity. I think a second area to consider that might be useful is providing some additional value for different groups. Now value could be applied in many different ways. That might be some kind of discounting. That could be the provision of some level of free service or provision. So in my field, for instance, virtually all of the publishers have been providing open access to articles that relate to COVID-19 as open access. You know, that's kind of, I think, been a really positive step. But there are lots of different ways, I think, that different organizations can do that with their own knowledge of their client and customer base. I would say the third point and final point on this is just be mindful that while it is highly appreciated when you do provide additional value, if the other person or the group gets a sniff that you are taking advantage, or that you're using this as an opportunistic kind of marketing ploy, then I think it will backfire. So if it's just a way for you to instrumentally sort of strengthen your brand, you know, or suddenly get lots and lots of customers in a way that's just doesn't come across very well, then I think that could backfire in the long term. You may get some quick wins in the short term, but I think it's not a good strategy in the medium to long term. So I think there is a bit of a balancing act between ensuring that you're first showing the value you're already providing. Second, that you're providing value to those people that you're communicating to right now. But alongside that, just being mindful that you're not sort of either boasting or being perceived as kind of opportunistic. So I think there's a bit of a tightrope you have to walk there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely, you know, it's a little bit of a fine line between, you know, actually supporting people and marketing ploys, you know.
Yeah.
Definitely. So we do have a question there from Nick. We'll get back to that just at the end. So the next one that we just had here, kind of should messaging come from the company itself or from a company figurehead or both? I mean, this is kind of obviously related to, you know, we're seeing a fair amount of CEOs and top people in organizations kind of posting when they wouldn't regularly post about, you know, about things, broadcasting messages versus their company doing that, or, you know, even more just general senior leaders in companies. So, I mean, obviously in some cases this can be a negative, but I mean, from our experience, we've always recommended that, you know, the senior leaders engage, but at the same time, we have seen that a lot of this, it can almost come across insincere, because if you've never ever posted anything before, and all of a sudden you're now saying you're the CEO of whatever company. I mean, if it's a little bit different if it's smaller, but if, you know, you're in a scale up stage or something like that, and suddenly you're starting to post a bunch of stuff about this, it does come across as a little bit insincere, especially if it's all, you know, kind of surrounded about that what we were kind of discussing, which was the, you know, the facts that, you know, your message is a message of support, but, you know, if you're doing it, you know, to maybe hopefully get customers in the long term, but you are trying to do it genuinely, if you do it that way, you're going to probably come across not genuine. So that's been our experience. I don't know if that's something that you have come across at all in the past in terms of, I guess you could say, almost celebrity or company figureheads versus just the companies themselves.
Yeah, and it's a great question. There's a lot of research that's been done on sort of two branches of reputation. You know, you've got kind of the individual reputation, and often that literature is known as kind of the celebrity CEO literature. And there's a whole bunch of evidence around when things are going positively well, and a CEO is performing well, then that has a contagion effect on the other aspect of reputation, which is the organization's reputation. In most cases, we're talking about corporations, but that could also apply to, a government department or to a charity, for instance. So there is, I guess the opening point to make here is that there is a strong relationship between kind of individual leader reputation and organizational reputation. And as you've alluded to, Michael, when things are going really well, you want your celebrity leader to be doing that communication, because him or her is the figurehead, and they bring personalization, they bring a human side to the business, and that can be really positive. But of course, as we know very well, there's countless examples of where individuals have been embroiled in a scandal, or a leader has made a slip up, a faux pas, and there, the contagion works in a negative way, right? Where actually it can have the inverse effect. So it's going to sound like a bit of a fence-sitting response to your question, but I would generally say that it sort of depends. But let's assume that you feel confident that as a leader, it's going to be well received, that you're communicating directly with different stakeholders, then I would say that it would be a good thing to ensure that a person or a set of people are actually communicating, as opposed to having a sort of a corporate message. Because I think a corporate message, tends to be dehumanizing. It tends to be sort of more focused on a brand rather than a sort of a personalized message. But, if you didn't feel confident with a particular leader giving a message, or you feel it would be so out of sync, as you were saying before, with kind of previous messaging before COVID-19, then actually in terms of authenticity, it might be better to keep with kind of a more corporate type of messaging. So sorry to sit on the fence with my response, Michael.
I mean, I think you can't do much about that, because in reality, I mean, reputation, like we kind of established in the beginning, is not exactly, a hard and fast thing, right? So it's managing it is not the easiest thing in the world, but trying to do it is obviously more important. So, it's kind of even almost a common sense thing that, if I was to get this from, my, let's say, software provider, or person that, runs my payroll software, or someone who, sells me X, would I think that this is very strange coming from them before? Have I ever seen anything from them? Versus the company reaching out to me, or is it, the support people that are reaching out to me? So, I mean, when you look at it from like a user perspective, as, a lot of product and product marketing decisions are made, it kind of makes sense to think about at least, how you would feel getting that message, and if you're just getting it out of the blue and you've never ever gotten anything before, I mean, personally, I wouldn't like it. So it's kind of like, look at not only what is value adding to those people, but also, pretend you're one of those people and see it, and how you would appreciate that type of message coming across. That's where what we've seen for the most part kind of being the right area.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, just a quick recap. Obviously, I mean, we went through the different types, kind of main 4 types of reputation, straight into those, those main questions. And like I said, we'll have this presentation, those questions linked to the article as well, for everyone put together when we do get this posted out. So those will be able to, review it in a little bit more detail. And then obviously some of those main questions, but I think it comes back to really in the end of one overarching theme that, you're not going to be able to do, let's say, one step-by-step action to, basically has a template to improve your reputation. But what you can do is, take those questions, review what you're doing, engage internally first, and then, I mean, if you want to take it a step farther, you can, do external user interviews on your messaging campaigns on that to find out what people actually appreciate. But in general, kind of take a common sense view of it. Know that you could cross the line if you try and make your support messaging or transparency or into essentially a a sales tool. So don't do that. Focus on more of it on, this will actually legitimately improve our reputation as we go through. Lots of companies are trashing theirs. So that's going to be a pretty big positive step for people. So that's kind of my quick overview. I mean, if there's if you could do one or two sentences on reputation, what the most important thing that anyone can think of when they're first approaching this topic if they never have before.
Yeah, I would just remind you that reputation isn't a singular thing. It's not just one particular activity. As I alluded to earlier, there are kind of multiple aspects of reputation. So thinking about what are your kind of core products and services, who are the key people you need to engage with, how are you engaging in different geographic locations if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions. And then the final point really to make is that, reputation is about the long-term game. It's not about kind of short-term wins, which I think we kind of touched upon, Michael, in some of our discussions about, just not playing these kind of short-term games of quick wins, because in the reputation field, the famous, Warren Buffett quotation, it can take 20 years to build a reputation and it can be lost within a few seconds. That's, I think, something to just to think about and reflect on relentlessly, because you don't want to be kind of finding yourself in a reputational crisis, because then it's going to take you a long time to recover from that.
Absolutely, and that's and whether that applies to the messaging you do or the actions you take, definitely consider that, because I mean, as I think a lot of people have seen, just in relation to something like concrete, like a cost cutting measure where people are, firing staff or laying them off or what have you, or maybe they've decided to cut the process for their hiring or, something like that as an example. If you can afford it and this isn't actually, you're not fighting, to survive, like as an example, the hospitality industry, that's a different story, but a lot of tech firms don't really have that issue. It's just they're not maybe growing as fast, and if you do things like cut your staff or extend processes too long, or maybe don't pivot your product or whatever it might be, and you don't and you take maybe a drastic action, the people who are in that process, who are your staff or whatever it might be, are not going to, that's not going to look good on you. And as it goes through this process, you're seeing tons of things popping up, different websites, talking about companies that have misused, applying for loans in the US as an example, or, companies that have fired staff when they didn't need to, or, whatever it might be. But these things are popping up everywhere, almost like hit lists of companies to never deal with again. So think about your actions before you take them, and keeping that mind on reputation, of course. So I mean,
and just to add to that, Michael, to be mindful that your actions will have an impact on you as an individual, as well as your teams and the organizations that you serve.
Absolutely. So I know we have a question here from Nick. I don't know if that's popped on the screen because I've actually never used Zoom, so I did click answer live, but I'm not sure what that actually does. So I'll just read it out here for you. What is the relationship between reputation, company values, and customer experience? Should the reputation strategy be ultimately shaped by these?
Thanks, Nick. I would say that reputation generally is an outcome. And so my general approach would be to think carefully about what are your sort of high level aspects of your business. So, most businesses, have a mission, they have a purpose, they have a set of values, and they're kind of the higher level. And then strategy for me is the connection between some of those high level sort of aspirations with kind of operational details. So from, if you've got a good, effective strategy, then that leads, to very clear goals that you set, and KPIs, key performance indicators. So I think it's important to have kind of the detailed aspect of your business, you know, the goals and the KPIs, and to have those kind of values, vision, mission statements, and the strategy is the connection between that. I would say that the reputation is an outcome of that. If there is alignment between the big picture and the detail, and it's done in a coherent way, then your reputation will follow in a positive way. Now, of course, it's not a linear process. You know, you may start to think, well, actually, these kind of KPIs or products, they don't really seem to link at all with our values. So maybe we need to start to rethink, well, what are some of our values? Do we need to kind of re-evaluate them? But I do think kind of a good organizational structure connects the big picture with the detail, and reputation as a general rule will be an outcome of that process, but it should be feeding into that process, particularly, you know, if there's some misalignment.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. A lot of, when you work with a lot of organizations on how to kind of do their strategy and, you know, whether that be product or marketing or just in general for their executive teams, that's obviously one of the big things that always people tend to start with, you know, company values, and that type of thing. But what we've done quite a lot of, and seems to be a very good way to start at least, is to think about how you know want to be seen. So almost your reputation and what you want and what your goals are, and you know how what kind of value you're adding or want to add to, you know, your customers or your community. So this is obviously considering that this isn't like a startup. This is obviously a business that already exists and is looking at maybe reframing that and trying to make sure they're in the right place. So kind of like you say, it's that is the outcome that they kind of want to achieve, to a certain extent. So you can't necessarily, you know, you're not going to be able to just automatically do that. But you know, if you have a broad overview of what you actually want or how you want to look and how you want to be perceived, then you can take that and, you know, build your strategy, which, you know, kind of puts together your customer experience, you know, the values and the product as well itself.
Yeah, and from the academic literature, it fits very well. So there's a concept known as identity, which is how an organization sees itself, whereas reputation is defined as how others perceive the organization. And I know it seems maybe so obvious, but often there is a significant disconnect between how organizations see themselves and what they stand for and what people outside the organization perceive of that organization. And that's what I was getting at with misalignment. If you've got a misalignment there, or at least a significant misalignment, then you're going to have to do something in terms of kind of reevaluating your modus operandi, because that kind of misalignment is not sustainable. Let's say you're an energy company and you're claiming to be green, but actually a lot of your external stakeholders really don't see you either being green or moving towards kind of a green type of direction. Well, you might get away with it for a bit, but over a certain period of time, that's not going to sustain itself. And so that's where you need to ultimately have alignment between, yeah, what I would term from the literature, organizational identity and organizational reputation.
Awesome, awesome. I do have a few other questions that came in from some of our other feeds here. So actually, this one was answered before, but it's, is there a level of transparency that will actually create distrust? You kind of already went through that, but you know, and is it a good idea to put forward messaging to customers and audience about their internal strategy, and kind of elaborate a little bit more on that point, about that level of transparency with external parties about your internal situation?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one, and it may to some extent depend upon your structure, because if you're a publicly listed organization, now there are some obviously legal aspects to kind of what you can and should be disclosing publicly, but your kind of communication externally might be quite different to let's say compared to if you're kind of a startup organization, fairly small but maybe growing quite quickly. That kind of communication style will be quite different. But I would say as a general principle, and particularly keeping focus on the circumstances right now, I think it is appreciated and valued when you're kind of open and honest around the current circumstances that you're facing. Sometimes I think there is this mindset that, you know, we need to put a shield around our organization and not to give kind of an inch in terms of any vulnerability in the system. Maybe that's true in certain organizational structures and types of organizations. Maybe that does apply. But for most organizations, I would say bringing a human aspect to this and some honesty around the situation. That doesn't mean going into details around sort of how many people you're going to have to furlough and kind of losses of revenue projected over the next 6 to 12 months. I don't think that's necessary. But I think some honesty around the situation is useful, and actually counterintuitively, some of that honesty can lead to greater goodwill and willingness to partner with people, as opposed to the often erroneous perception that by being more honest, it makes you more vulnerable. I don't think necessarily that's true, so long as you manage kind of that tightrope that we were talking about walking earlier.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there was another point here, but again, it looks like we did kind of answer it. It was just more around, you know, the actual actionable advice for that. So, I mean, I think we kind of answered that there's no real, let's say, step-by-step process that you can take versus, you know, just starting somewhere. You know, so if you haven't really been considering, you know, reputation in terms of, you know, your messaging or your product and what kind of features you've actually developed and who you're helping, and, you know, whether that be, you know, your customers with new features, or, you know, free use, or, you know, just supporting charities, or any of these types of things that you're actually taking, or just your messaging in general, you know, just related to the current situation. Start somewhere and look at how you want to be, you know, perceived, because there's no real, let's say, step-by-step process. But if you go through these different, you know, the different questions, the different types of reputation, and kind of consider it, then that'll make a big impact for you, at
Yeah,
least to start with.
exactly. And I would just add one other point, which is recognize that you probably need a sort of a circular approach rather than a linear approach, meaning that whatever approach you take, you need to build in mechanisms through which you can gain feedback from others, whether that's your employees, whether it's your customers, whether it's your investors. Rather than just saying, we're going to take this approach and we're going to follow these steps. That would be a linear approach, but there's no way to kind of circle back and think, actually, is this the right approach? So I think if you've got a flexible circular type of approach where you can build in the feedback and maybe slightly shift your approach, that doesn't mean completely throwing your original approach in the bin, but it just means finessing, then I think that's probably a better strategy than just, right, this is our approach and we're going to follow it to a thumb.
Yeah, and I mean, being flexible is obviously a key point here, no matter what, you know, with things changing every day. So
Yeah.
not much we can really do about that. So, I mean, I don't think we have any more questions on here. I have seen a few things. Thanks, Tim, for that. And we do have obviously a white paper that will come out of this. It's more of a overview than a white paper, just things that we've talked about, and, you know, kind of a notes on our sessions so that people can get a, you know, an easier overview. So if anyone wants that, you know, throw a message in the Q&A or the direct chat to me, just with a white paper or overview, right in the box there, or from any of the live streams. So for those of you that did reach out to me previously, or, you know, during this session, I want to just have a quick chat about this. Totally open for that. Will, I'm not sure if, you know, you're open to, you know, get questions from people, but we're happy to put those together if something happens, and send them over to you in an email if there's a, you know, kind of external questions that people have. So I think that's a good way to do that on that front.
Yeah, no problem.
Send them just across if there's any, if you know, if there's a way you want people to send them through. Just let me know after, we can put that together, you know, for people to contact you if that's something that you're open to, of course.
Yeah.
So I think that covers pretty much everything. Obviously, anyone that I have a one-on-one schedule with after this about this, look forward to speaking to you then. Next week, we do have another session for anyone that wants to join. We'll be announcing that probably tomorrow. I think that's pretty much it for today. Really appreciate the time, Will. I think
Thanks, Michael.
have a bunch of other notes on here from people saying they really appreciate that as well. Yep. Awesome. Really appreciate it, and I think we'll cut this off here because we are over time a little bit. I'll let you go, and thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.